Hi, I'm Matt Epic, creator from Clemency and some other stuff. This is a quick video to go over some tool design issues I have with Halo Infinite Forge. The tool's great, but here's a handful of reasonably fixable things about it that just drive me absolutely nuts, from most to least annoying. I use Forge on keyboard and mouse, so I'll be using that for demonstration, but most of these apply to controller too. Number 1. No duplicate in place. When you place an object in Forge, it places the new one at some arbitrary point directly in front of the camera, and while that can be handy for placing things like spawns or trees, in the case of phased objects like map geometry, this is annoying the overwhelming majority of the time, and makes a lot of things more time-consuming than they need to be. I like to see an additional hotkey that duplicates the object in the exact position of the existing one, so you can just move it from there instead of close to the camera like it does now, which would be similar to the behavior in Blender or Unity or other 3D software. Number 2, newly created objects start off-grid. That makes sense when the movement or rotation type isn't set to world space, but when it is, there's not really any reason why objects wouldn't be on the grid, because 90% of the time you're going to need to move them onto the grid to use them anyway. It's just kind of a waste of time, I think. Number 3, resizing objects as part of building like base map geometry is a pain, because you only scale it around the object's center or pivot. An additional scaling function similar to Unity's rectangle scale mode would be ideal, where the object has lines appear around it in like a box, and you just drag them out, and it automatically moves the object so that it just extends out in that direction instead of around the center. Number 4, the movement and scale gizmos on keyboard and mouse are super cumbersome to use. The click regions for multi-axis adjustment are super unclear, and it's possible for the camera angle to just entirely occlude a single axis. Like if you're towards X and Y and you want to click Z but you're below X and Y, you can't click through them. You always click X and Y together first. You can't access Z until you move the camera, and it's super annoying. Switching to a style of gizmo like Unity or Blender uses, where the click zones are a lot tighter and there's like a separate selectable for multi-axis control, would be much easier to use. Number 5, primitive object scales are questionable. Like, the banished forward blocks are fine. The UNSC block is a little weird, but it's fine. It has extra detailing, so it needs to be larger. The primitive block, with no detailing at all, is the issue, because it's just barely off scale on X and Y, meaning that when you scale it, it doesn't properly align to any grid size. These are what you're building most of your map geometry out of, which means it's extremely common to get things like Z-fighting or inconsistent scaling around corners, where the sizes just don't line up because it's not on scale at all. In a perfect world, you could put 2 right triangle primitives together and... Okay, number 5.5, why are there no right triangle primitives? Number 6, the geometry budget in Infinite is really high, but some objects use more of it than you'd think. It'd be nice if the exact budget impact of each object was laid out in the palette like in the older games. Number 7, it's really tricky to find specific scripting nodes sometimes, and a search function would help a lot with that. It's especially tricky because the categories nodes are placed in is super inconsistent. Like how the for each nodes for bots and objects and players are all in the logic section, but for each generic item is in the lists section for some reason. While we're at it, I'd also like to ask for player events for shooting, jumping, AI scanning, and a node to get AI squads by spawner. Thanks. Number 8, getting kinda petty here, but we're only able to switch manipulation pivots, manipulating the object based on its center or its actual pivot point, while in rotate mode, even though the settings does affect other modes and your selection in rotate mode carries over to those. It's especially an issue because the position info on the bottom of your screen represents the active pivot's position, not the actual position shown in the object properties, which is always based on the object's real pivot. Simple fix for this, just make it to where you can switch between world pivot and object pivot at any time instead of only in rotation mode. The key is free on PC. Nothing else is even using the key when you're in the other modes, so like there's not really any issue there. Speaking of which, number 9, why can't we rebind any of these controls on PC? Some of them are really inconvenient, like snap adjustments and snap to ground and magnet toggle are all on the opposite side of the keyboard from everything else, even though there's plenty of unused keys around. It would also be nice to have an option on controller to rebind things. I mean, the entire rest of the game can be rebinded. Why not Forge? Anyway, that's my list for now. I tried to keep it to things that are reasonably fixable without like huge new additions. Feel free to share this around, ideally straight into 343's offices, because improvements in these areas would be a significant help to everybody who uses Forge for mapping, including them. And stay tuned for another campaign map one of these days. It's gonna be pretty sick.